Hey, what's up? Welcome back to another video. Today I want to show you how I approach designing something whenever it's been a while since I did any art. I'm just coming back from a big Christmas break and I'm feeling pretty rusty, so hopefully you can make something cool happen today. But before we start, I just wanted to share with you guys that with the help of Sasha 3D, I started a Patreon where I share my sculpts as 3D prints. You can see me in the background detailing this guy, doing some little panel lines. We already have a couple of different models on there that should be really fun to print and paint, such as this one and this one. So please check it out and let me know what you think in the comments. Going into this sculpt, I had a vague idea of what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to make something that was quite chunky, but that was about the extent of it. So before starting the sculpt, I looked online for some cool images, just something that was inspiring. And I made a little ref board with it, with this program called PureRef. And throughout the whole sculpt, I had that ref board pinned in VR space above my head, so I can look at it whenever I wanted. Even after years of experience of making mechs, it's still super helpful to be able to look at reference pictures whenever you're feeling stuck or whenever you're trying to design something and you don't have a clear picture in head of exactly what you want to make. I started this session by just trying to block out some different shapes, get a good sense of proportions for my mech. But mostly since I was so rusty, I just wanted to loosen up. I already knew that my first couple attempts would not be as great as they could be. So I was just trying to get the bad ideas out first. You need to be quite in the zone to be able to nail your design on the first go. And coming back from a long break, I was definitely not in the zone. But I still try to have fun with it, keeping stuff loose and working fast. It allows me to not be too attached to things and just be able to throw it away if it doesn't work, because I didn't invest a lot of time in making something. I'm basically treating these quick sculpts as thumbnails or sketches. And whenever I feel that there's something there and that it's worth investing more time, then I polish it up. But as long as I'm not happy with it, it's sometimes faster to just start over than trying to fix something that you know isn't gonna work. The second attempt already was better. The proportions were more interesting, and I tried to make something as thick as I could. I wanted the focus of this mech to be the legs, so that's what I started with. And then I blocked out a face just to give it some personality. I knew I was gonna refine everything later on anyway, so I didn't spend too much time trying to make the perfect face or the perfect design for the legs. It's just about blocking the general shape of the object and see if your proportions work or not. Like right now, the shoulders and the arms are way too big, and one way to make the legs appear larger is to have smaller arms. So I try to correct that as well, and it makes the design look better, but I still wasn't happy with the whole thing, so I also ended up scrapping this one. I tried to make all of the mechs approximately the same size so I could judge them against each other to see what's too big or what's too small. And with a classic Goldilocks scenario, the third one ended up being the right amount of everything. So I'm really happy I just spent some time to loosen up and get back in the zone before committing to something. The more experience you have, the faster you're able to narrow down what you're trying to make. And if you're just starting out, I highly recommend you do an insane amount of thumbnails or sketches before you start to make something. Whenever I was teaching a design class on props and vehicles, I had students make 100 thumbnails of anything they wanted. And the purpose of that exercise was to make them realize that the first, let's say 30 to 40 thumbnails that they were making was just something that they hadn't seen before, a design that existed. For example, if somebody had to design 100 spaceships, they would do an X-Wing, and then they would do, a Millennium Falcon, and then they would do a spaceship from their favorite game. And it's only after running out of ideas that they would actually come up with their own interesting solution. But realistically, if you're a beginner and you want to start to make a robot or something like that, do at least 20 thumbnails and try to pick your favorite one. Chances are you're going to have a hard time picking only one. There's going to be a couple that are going to seem good, and that's a good thing because any of them you choose will be good enough for you. And then it's going to be worth it to invest some time to polish it up all the way up to finish. You gotta like your sketch from the beginning because that's usually how art goes. You start off with a lot of energy, and if you're not convinced on your own design from the beginning, it will be super tedious to work on something that you hate. Iterating fast and failing fast is the best way to avoid that. I spent about 30 minutes to make all 3 of those sketches, and that was probably the most important part of this whole process. I was comparing all 3 sketches together, and I went back to the first one trying to see if I could make it work, but it was just objectively worse than the last one I did. The last one had more sophisticated and refined proportions. I found that the first one was really clunky and kind of cheesy. The second one wasn't too bad, but I felt like I would have had to spend a lot of time and energy to make it work, as the third one was working right away. At that point, I knew I had something interesting, and I committed to the whole ZAKU thing, and I tried to make the fattest ZAKU I could. With this project, I didn't have a clear direction in mind when I started, but I would approach professional work where I have a precise brief the exact same way. The majority of my time at the beginning would be spent to make very different ideas. After my 3 sketches, I then took a break, and when I came back, I tried to make the second guy happen because it was still interesting, and I tried to see if I could make the super fat ZAKU happen, but I wasn't really happy with where it was going. I still think it's interesting to see the process of me failing to design something because you can kind of see where I learn and where I adapt. I end up keeping only the little spike from the second guy. I then move past the sketch phase and I start to assign color to my mech. To keep the vibe of the ZAKU, I try to have the same color distribution, even if the parts themselves have a different shape. I'm happy with the initial blocking stage, so I try to nail down the secondary shapes. Basically trying to break down my robot into more parts to create more visual interest. Learning where to place your detail and where to leave areas of rest comes with experience. So if you want to get better at it, you just have to practice. It's different for every single project you're gonna approach. There's rules and all that to where this stuff should be going, but at the end it comes down to your personal vision and your own taste. I have another video up where I go over how I detail stuff and how I make my pieces really clean. So if you want to learn more about that, go check it out. At this point I'm starting to refine the head. I look back at my ref and I try to see what part make up the face, but I also try to inject some of my personal taste into the design so it's not just a straight copy of an existing ZAKU. I try to bring some influence of like World War II helmets with the little brim, and I try to see if I can make some gas mask stuff happen. But in the end, the square mouth ends up being more iconic, so I go back to that. It's always an issue when trying to do this kind of fan arty work is improving on the original work. Hopefully you want to make it justice and not completely fuck up the original design. Here I clean up the eyeball section and nestle it into the skull. I also try to carve some space around it inside of the helmet, and I add a secondary gray color so I can link the eyeball to the rest of the helmet. As I work on this piece, I'm still figuring out secondary detail. I'll do another surface detail pass later on, so I'm not too worried about the geometry being super clean right now. I'm still trying to block stuff out, like the flaps on the side of the head and the little horn. I then indicate some detail, just to add a bit more complexity. And at this point, I think I got something that's decent, so I'm gonna group everything together and then scale it back and put it back on the body to see how it fits with the rest of the design. I block in some of the tubes so I can get a clear idea of the distribution of red versus gray. I then move on to the arms and I try to repeat the same process, getting a good distribution of red armor versus gray skeleton. I make a mask and then I split that part using the Boolean technique that I showed in another previous video. And I use the split tool where it's more convenient when I have a simple intersection. I make an instance copy out of the leg so I can work on it on the side, and everything I do on it is going to get repeated on the main sculpt. Working that way, I can see the part isolated, but I can also see it on the design itself. And then same process with every other piece. I try to get a good ratio of gray to red. And I turn off symmetry to be able to attach it on only one side. I know this piece is gonna get hidden by the kind of skirt that goes around the waist, so I'm not super worried about making the joint really perfect and clean. I'm designing with my end product in mind, which is gonna be a 3D print or just a really cool image, and it's not gonna be animated in a video game or a movie, so I can get away with just making it look really cool. I still think about the clearance in between the parts, but I'm not super anal about the joints themselves. And then jumping back on the upper arm section, I do the same thing where I make an instance and trying to figure out the joint placement and how it would attach to the torso. I add more complexity and details around the joint so that it looks complicated and to make it seem like it's a moving part. All this process is pretty repetitive, so I'm wondering if you guys actually find it interesting to see all of it, or should I just, skip when some cool stuff's happening? Because I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, and it's just like, hey, I'm detailing this, and I'm, getting a good balance of whatever. I'm just thinking to myself, if I was watching this video, I would probably get bored here and skip ahead. So maybe I'm wrong, let me know. Here I'm actually doing something interesting where I'm introducing a new part, which is the shoulder pad. I'm just sketching the general shape and then I'm gonna try to make it fit on the shoulder. It takes me a while to get this part right, and at the end I end up removing the red part from the upper shoulder or the upper arm because it's clipping too much with the shoulder pad. But that's for like way down the line where I'm doing the last pass of cleaning up. Now moving on the other shoulder and making the big shield. I stretch stuff out with no real regards for the geometry. I'm just trying to block out the armature for it. Basically like if I was doing a line art sketch of the shield. And then once I'm happy with the general proportion, I just block out a clean, flat surface. That way I'm gonna have an easier time working with it later on where I try to polish it up. It's always easier to work from something that's already clean rather than trying to grab something that's messy and clean it up. But the downside to that is that making stuff really clean is slow and it's not as flexible as just sketching it out really messy. Last little part of blocking in the armor is going to be the feet. I duplicate it and then I try to make a separation between the sole and the top of the shoe if you want. And I add detail around the joint. And I break up my part into good proportions, red and gray. I took a little break and I looked at some refs for the weapon, and I decided to go with the classic axe. But to fit the rest of the design, I went with some chubbier proportions. I move stuff around with the gizmo so that everything stays aligned to the handle. And since I have a good idea of what I'm doing with this piece in particular, I try to work as clean as I can, trying to nail down a really nice shape first. It's basically working in 2D at this point because the object is so flat. I'm just trying to get a good graphic read, if that makes sense. And then for the edge, I just make a wedge shape that I warp around. And I try to keep everything on different layers so that it's easier to cut them and move them around. And once I'm happy with a shape, I commit. I merge everything down, and then I can chop it up to get a super clean piece. Secondary shapes and details. And then I make little repeating details for the tube. I could detail this piece even more, but I don't want it to be too much of a focus, so if I do some crazy small detail on it, it might distract from other areas that I want to focus on, like the face. And to save time, I use my patented McNuggets VR Kit Bash Gundam hands, available on Gumroad, link in the description. But I modify them a little bit so that they're wider to fit the chunky neck. Fix the fingers as best as I can, and with the amazing power of VR, you can zoom in on every finger and place stuff super precisely, really quick. I would hate to have to do that in another program. And then why not try it with 2 axes instead of just 1. I took a look at a ref picture of the ZAKU, and I noticed some pieces in my design that I wanted to emphasize a little bit, like the tube around the mouth and the edge around the feet. I try to clean up around the ankles to make sure there's enough clearance, kinda, you know. It really doesn't have to work properly, it just has to look like it works properly. So with some experience, you look at stuff and you're like, it kind of looks right, well, it's probably kind of right. And then if you get hired by the Principality of Xi'an to build in real life, then you can spend some time to, you know, make sure it's engineered properly. But since we're making, you know, cool VR 3D stuff, it really doesn't matter that much. I'm really okay with just doing some pseudo engineering, but at the same time, I kind of keep the 3D printing process in mind and make sure stuff is intersecting properly, and it's gonna be easier for our friend Sasha to split up later on in ZBrush. The ZAKU is one of my favorite Gundam kits to build, and I've always wanted to make my own version of it, so once this is done being cleaned up and I can finally print it, it's really going to be a ton of fun. Like, I still can't believe I'm able to design my own mech in VR and just print them and have them on my desk. Like, that's still crazy to me. So if you like that stuff and you want to support me, I'd really appreciate if you check out the Patreon, and if you end up printing something or painting it, I'd be really grateful to see a picture of it. I always geek out when I see other people's collection of models and figurines, you know. And what I'd really like is to be able to collab with somebody that does like mini painting. I do a little bit of it myself, but I'm really not up to the level of some people that do crazy stuff. So if you'd be interested in that, or you know somebody that would be, please reach out online and we can make something sick together. Back to the sculpt, I just keep detailing stuff. This is the pretty low stress part because everything's kind of figured out. So I'm just moving around the whole sculpt, and every time I see a piece that I think that needs fixing, I just go in and, you know, detail a bit more. This whole feeling that I had at the beginning of the session, being like, oh, I'm rusty, at this point is just completely gone, and I just do what I do. And I'm just having a good time listening to music and making a cool robot, you know? We're approaching the third break of the session, and it's important to take breaks every hour or so. Just walk around, get your eyes off your design, you know, breathe a little bit, get a snack, get a drink, get a little bit of distance and perspective from your art. And then for this last section, I'm just gonna mega speed it up to about 10x. Maybe to a point where it gets a bit nauseating, so trigger warning, sorry. But it's really just me going around placing little small details on stuff where I think it needs it. I'm trying to explain as best as I can the process of making something and what's going on through my head when I do it, but at this point it's just really more intuitive than cerebral, if that makes sense. There's just really a lot of repetition, and the more you do, the better you get. It's really that simple, but it's not easy. It's just like seeing somebody do a push-up and be like, hey, I can do the same thing, and then trying to do 500 push-ups. The more you do this kind of sculpting, the more you're gonna understand it, the more you're gonna build a visual library of what kind of stuff looks good, the more you're gonna be able to express yourself and make something that you're happy with. At this point in the sculpt, we're on the third pass. So first we blocked out our initial shape. After that we did the secondary shapes, and now we're on the tertiary super small detail. You can go as small as you want, but I'm trying to control the size of it so that it makes sense in my design as a whole. So for example, I'm not going to put a ton of detail under the feet because I know that nobody is going to see that, and I'm going to put it directly on the face because I know everybody is going to look at the face of the robot. And here I finally decide to get rid of the red part on the upper arms, so that stuff is looking better and not clipping. Talked about it earlier in the video, but that's how long it took me to fix that thing. I try to also break the symmetry a bit so that the pose is more dynamic, and since everything is linked, whenever I do something on the right arm, it's going to get repeated on the left arm as well. And I go over the whole design, that last phase of super granular detail. And I know that if I want to have even smaller detail than that, it's gonna be stuff like decals and textures once I render it. The majority of the design decisions are already done, so it's really just adding bells and whistles on stuff. I make sure the hands are holding the weapons properly. I attach the shield to the shoulder. I make some kind of pseudo joint. And I add little bolts and tick marks all over the parts. Then this last little bit of the sculpt has to do with splitting up the big surface of the shield. Add some complexity and balance it out with some areas of rest for your eyes. here quickly fixing the fingers and then bullshitting some joints on top of it. And make sure that there's no clipping between the axe and the right hand. Last little cleanup on the face. And I boolean the floor with the feet so that they're flat and it sits properly on a surface. And I should have just erased it with a brush rather than boolean it because it took a while to compute everything. And then our sculpt is done. I tried exporting everything to Painter, but every time I was baking the high res on the low res, it will crash. So I was like, screw you Adobe, fix your stuff, and I'm just gonna use KeyShot instead because it's faster. I don't have to bake anything. It can handle a ton of geometry super fast, and I don't have to bother about any polygon limitations to a certain extent. Like you can see, this whole sculpt is about 20 million poly, which is still pretty low for what modeler can output. And with KeyShot, that you can just slap colors on stuff and then try a bunch of different color schemes and variation really quickly. It's maybe not as flexible as Painter for like textures and stuff, but you know, at least it works on the first try at least, and I don't have to waste time trying to make stuff work and re-export and re-import stuff all the time. I'm sure I can make it work if I spend enough time on it, but at this point I just wanted to have a clean finish, and I can try different lighting scenarios pretty quickly. I place lights around my object to get like a 3-point light situation. Mess around with the camera settings to get some, you know, flatter lenses, and try some depth of field. Change the color of the light and all that stuff. And if I wanted, I could even do decals on the surface in KeyShot, but again, that's slow as well, and if I wanted to do decals, I could just paint it on later on in Photoshop. So here's our finished sculpt. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you enjoy the session. I hope you learned something or you had fun. We'll try to get this model processed as fast as possible and ready to get 3D printed. So I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!